My wife had cancer, and when I begged my 3 kids for help, they all said the same thing. That's your problem, not ours. But here I am, 71 years old, sitting in my Oregon living room with my revised will in my hands. And guess what? Now, their inheritance is my problem, not theirs. The irony isn't lost on me that Michael, Sarah, and David spent 40 years assuming they'd inherit this house, my retirement savings, and everything Eleanor and I built together. But they couldn't spare a single day to help us when we needed them most. 6 months ago, when Eleanor got her diagnosis, stage 3 pancreatic cancer, I thought surely our children would rally around us the way families are supposed to do during a crisis. I was wrong, dead wrong. When I called Michael, my oldest, to tell him about his mother's condition, his first question wasn't, "How is Mom?" or "What can I do to help?" It was, "How much is this going to cost, and do you have good insurance?" When I explained that even with Medicare, we were looking at thousands in out-of-pocket expenses, not to mention the fact that I couldn't care for Eleanor alone during chemotherapy, he got quiet for a long moment before saying, "Dad, I've got my own family to worry about." And if you've ever faced a medical crisis and discovered that the people you raised, loved, and sacrificed for suddenly became too busy to care, then settle in close, because this old man has a story that'll break your heart and restore your faith in justice at the same time. What my children didn't understand is that when you abandon someone during their darkest hour, you forfeit any right to benefit from their brightest moments. They thought they could ignore Eleanor's suffering and still cash in on our success. The day I found out Eleanor had maybe 6 months to live, I sat right here in this chair and made a list of phone calls I needed to make. Call the oncologist, call the insurance company, call our attorney about updating medical directives, and call our children to let them know their mother was dying and we needed help. 3 out of 4 of those calls went exactly as planned. The 4th call, actually 3 calls to 3 different children, taught me something about family that I wish I'd never had to learn. You see, for 45 years, Eleanor and I put our children first. We paid for their educations, helped with down payments on their first homes, babysat grandchildren whenever asked, and always made sure they knew they could count on us for anything. We thought we were building a foundation of love and mutual support that would last through whatever challenges life might bring. We were building something all right, but it wasn't what we thought. If you believe that people should face consequences for their choices, especially when those choices involve abandoning elderly parents in crisis, go ahead and subscribe, because I've got more tales of holding ungrateful children accountable than you might expect. And if you want to know what happens when 3 selfish adults discover that inheritance isn't a right, but a privilege that can be revoked, well, you're about to learn that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people live with the consequences of their own decisions. Michael, Sarah, and David weren't always selfish, and that's what makes their abandonment during Eleanor's illness so devastating. I remember when they were young, how they'd fight over who got to sit next to their mother during family movie nights, how they'd make her handmade cards for every holiday, how they'd race to be the first to hug her when she came home from her job at the elementary school. Eleanor was the heart of our family, the one who remembered birthdays, organized holiday gatherings, and somehow managed to make each child feel like they were her favorite. I taught all 3 of them to drive in the old Buick that's still sitting in my garage, spent countless Saturday mornings at soccer games and piano recitals, helped with homework that seemed impossibly difficult until we worked through it together. When Michael struggled with algebra, I spent entire evenings at this kitchen table breaking down equations until something clicked. When Sarah had her heart broken by that Johnson boy in high school, Eleanor and I stayed up all night listening to her cry and reassuring her that she was worthy of better love. When David wanted to start his own business after college, we co-signed his loan, even though it meant risking our own financial security. For decades, our house was the center of family celebrations. Christmas mornings with grandchildren tearing through wrapping paper while Eleanor made her famous cinnamon rolls. Thanksgiving dinners, where our dining room table couldn't quite accommodate everyone, but we squeezed together anyway. Birthday parties, graduations, anniversaries, every milestone was celebrated here because Eleanor insisted that family traditions mattered, that creating memories was more important than convenience. Even as adults, our children stayed connected to us in ways that made me proud. Michael would call every Sunday evening to catch up on the week's events. Sarah brought the grandkids over every few weeks for Eleanor to spoil with homemade cookies and stories about their parents' childhoods. David always remembered our anniversary, sending flowers and a card that made Eleanor cry happy tears. When neighbors commented on how close our family was, Eleanor would beam with pride and say, "We raised them right." Looking back, I wonder if we actually raised them too well, not in terms of values, but in terms of expectations. We were always there for them, always ready to help, always putting their needs before our own. Maybe we trained them to expect support without ever teaching them to give it. Maybe by being such reliable parents, we accidentally raised children who assumed care and sacrifice only flowed in one direction. When Eleanor got sick, and suddenly we were the ones who needed help, they simply didn't know how to be the givers instead of the receivers. The saddest part is that they had every opportunity to show love and support during Eleanor's illness, every chance to demonstrate that the values we'd taught them had taken root. Instead, they showed me exactly who they'd become when helping others required actual sacrifice from them. The first crack in my faith in our family appeared during Eleanor's second week of chemotherapy, when she was so sick she couldn't keep down water, let alone solid food. I'd been sleeping in the recliner next to our bed for days, getting up every few hours to help her to the bathroom or hold a cool cloth to her forehead while she threw up. At 71, I wasn't exactly in prime caregiving shape myself, but I was doing everything I could to keep Eleanor comfortable and maintain some dignity during the worst of her treatment. That's when I swallowed my pride and called Michael to ask if maybe he could take a few days off work to help me care for his mother. Not permanently, not even for a week, just a few days so I could get some real sleep and maybe take a shower that lasted longer than 5 minutes. I explained that Eleanor was having a particularly rough time with this round of chemo, that the doctor said it might get worse before it got better, and that I was struggling to manage everything alone. Michael's response still echoes in my ears. "Dad, I've got a big presentation at work next week, and honestly, isn't this what you signed up for when you got married? In sickness and in health, right?" The casual cruelty of that comment hit me like a physical blow. Yes, I had promised to care for Eleanor in sickness and in health, but I'd also thought that raising children meant they'd be there for us when we needed them. Apparently, those were two very different assumptions. When I called Sarah next, hoping maybe she'd have more compassion since she was a mother herself, I got a different excuse but the same result. "Dad, I'd love to help, but the kids have school and soccer practice. And Jim's traveling for work this month. Maybe you could hire a nurse or something?" Hire a nurse. With what money? The medical bills were already stretching our fixed income to the breaking point, but Sarah seemed to think professional caregivers just appeared out of thin air without cost. David's response was perhaps the most honest, if also the most hurtful. "Look, Dad, Mum's cancer isn't my responsibility. You two are adults, you've got insurance, and there are resources for this kind of thing. I can't just drop everything because you're having a hard time." The word responsibility stuck with me long after that phone call ended. Apparently, 40 years of being responsible for him meant nothing when the tables were turned. What struck me most wasn't just their refusal to help, but their complete lack of emotional engagement with what Eleanor and I were going through. None of them asked about her prognosis, her pain levels, her fears, or how she was coping emotionally with the reality of possibly dying. They treated her cancer like an inconvenient scheduling conflict rather than a family crisis that required all hands on deck. That week, As I continued caring for Eleanor alone while she suffered through the worst of her chemotherapy, I started to see my children clearly for the first time in years. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in October when Eleanor collapsed in our bathroom and I couldn't lift her by myself. She'd been getting weaker with each round of treatment, but that morning she was so frail that when she fainted, her 90-pound frame felt impossibly heavy to my aging arms. I called 911, and while we waited for the ambulance, I held my wife on our bathroom floor, both of us crying. Her from pain and fear, me from the overwhelming helplessness of watching the love of my life slip away while feeling completely alone in caring for her. At the hospital, the doctor pulled me aside and explained that Eleanor's latest scans showed the cancer had spread, despite the aggressive treatment. We were looking at weeks, maybe a month or two at most. The medical team recommended hospice care, which meant I'd need to set up our home for round-the-clock attention, manage pain medications, coordinate with nurses, and essentially become Eleanor's full-time caregiver during her final days. The social worker handed me a stack of pamphlets about caregiving resources and gently suggested that family support would be crucial during this transition. That afternoon, I made what I thought would be my children's wake-up call. I didn't ask for help this time. I begged for it. I called each of them and explained that their mother was dying, that she had maybe 8 weeks left, and that I needed them to step up and help me give her a dignified, comfortable death at home. I wasn't asking them to quit their jobs or abandon their families, just to create a schedule where someone could be with us, help with basic care, and let Eleanor spend her final days surrounded by the children she'd devoted her life to raising. Michael's response was swift and brutal. "Dad, this is your problem, not mine. I didn't choose to get cancer, and I can't fix it. You're her husband. This is what you're supposed to do." Sarah was only slightly more tactful. "I wish I could help, but I just can't take on that kind of responsibility right now. My own family has to come first." David didn't even pretend to consider it. "Look, I'm sorry Mom is sick, but I can't put my life on hold because you two didn't plan better for this kind of situation." The word responsibility kept coming up in these conversations, always used to explain why they couldn't help rather than why they should. Somehow, in their minds, caring for the woman who had given them life, raised them with infinite patience and love, and supported their dreams unconditionally was not their responsibility. But inheriting the wealth she and I had accumulated over 45 years of marriage, that was apparently their birthright. That night, I sat beside Eleanor's hospital bed, holding her hand while she slept, and I made a decision that would change everything. If our children couldn't be bothered to help us during the most difficult period of our lives, they certainly didn't deserve to benefit from the fruits of our labor after we were gone. Some lessons can only be taught through consequences, and my children were about to get an education they'd never forget. The final weeks of Eleanor's life were marked by a silence so profound it felt like our children had not just abandoned us, but had erased us from their lives entirely. I brought Eleanor home from the hospital on a Thursday, and by Saturday, I had transformed our bedroom into a makeshift hospice unit with a hospital bed, oxygen tank, and enough medical equipment to stock a small clinic. The hospice nurse came twice a week, but the rest of the time it was just me and Eleanor facing her final journey without the children we'd raised to be part of our family's most important moments. I stopped calling Michael, Sarah, and David for updates because their responses had become predictably cruel. When I'd tried to tell Michael that his mother was asking for him, he'd actually said, "Dad, I can't handle this emotional stuff right now. Just let me know when it's over." When I'd mentioned to Sarah that Eleanor wanted to see her grandchildren one more time, she'd explained that seeing their grandmother so sick might be traumatic for the kids. David had stopped answering my calls altogether after telling me that death is just part of life, and I needed to deal with it like an adult. The worst part wasn't their absence during Eleanor's final weeks. It was the complete lack of curiosity about how she was doing, whether she was in pain, what her final wishes might be, or how I was coping with watching my life partner fade away. They seemed to have compartmentalized her dying as something happening to other people, something that didn't require their attention or emotional investment. Not once did any of them ask if Eleanor had any messages for them, any final words of love or wisdom she wanted to share. Eleanor died on a Tuesday morning in November while I was holding her hand and reading her favorite psalms. Her last words were about our children, not angry words, but sad ones. "Harold," she whispered, "I hope someday they understand what they've missed." She died believing that our children's absence was more about fear and inability to cope than about actual selfishness. Even at the end, Eleanor was more generous in her interpretation of their behavior than they deserved. I called each of them to tell them their mother had died. Michael said he'd try to make it to the funeral depending on his work schedule. Sarah asked if we could postpone the service until the following week because she had already committed to a school fundraiser. David's first question was whether Eleanor had updated her will recently and when we could expect to settle the estate. Not one of them asked how she died, whether she suffered or if she had any final words for them. That week, planning Eleanor's funeral alone, while our children treated her death like a minor inconvenience, I realized that grief has a way of clarifying what really matters and who really cares. 2 weeks after Eleanor's funeral, while I was still sorting through her belongings and trying to figure out how to live alone in a house full of memories, my phone rang with a call that would change everything. It was David, but for the first time in months, he sounded genuinely interested in having a conversation. "Dad," he said with uncharacteristic warmth, "I've been thinking about you and wondering how you're handling everything. Sarah and I were talking, and we think maybe we should get together soon to discuss the future." The future. After 6 months of telling me that Eleanor's cancer was my problem and my responsibility, suddenly my children were interested in discussing the future. The conversation that followed was both enlightening and disgusting. David wanted to know about my estate planning, whether Eleanor and I had updated our wills recently, and what my intentions were regarding the family assets. Sarah called the next day with similar concerns, carefully wrapped in language about wanting to make sure I was taken care of, but clearly focused on understanding her potential inheritance. When Michael finally called, he didn't even pretend to be subtle. "Dad, I know this is a difficult time, but we need to talk about practical matters. The house is probably too big for you now, and managing all those investments might be overwhelming. Sarah, David, and I have been discussing how we can help you transition to something more manageable." By "help me transition," he meant help themselves to the property Eleanor and I had spent 45 years accumulating. The irony was breathtaking. These were the same children who couldn't spare a single day to help care for their dying mother, who had told me repeatedly that her illness was not their responsibility, who had been too busy with their own lives to even visit during her final weeks. But now that Eleanor was gone, and they were thinking about inheritance, suddenly they had time for family conversations. Suddenly they wanted to be involved in my decision-making. Suddenly my well-being was their concern. That's when I made an appointment with Attorney Williams to discuss some major changes to my estate planning. The will Eleanor and I had created years ago left everything to our 3 children in equal shares. The house, our retirement savings, the life insurance money, everything we'd worked for and saved. But that will had been written when we still believed we'd raise children who would be there for us when we needed them most. The evidence of the past 6 months had proven that assumption catastrophically wrong. The new will I dictated to Attorney Williams was elegantly simple. Our house would go to the local hospice organization that had provided such compassionate care during Eleanor's final weeks. Our savings would be split between 3 cancer research foundations. The life insurance money would fund a scholarship for young people pursuing careers in caregiving. And our children, Our children would receive exactly what they'd given us during our time of greatest need. Nothing. But I wasn't done yet. Attorney Williams helped me craft a letter that would be read to Michael, Sarah, and David when my will was eventually read, explaining exactly why they'd been disinherited and what they could have done differently. 6 months after Eleanor's death, I'm sitting in our living room, surrounded by the same family photos that once represented my proudest achievements. Pictures of graduations, weddings, grandchildren's birthdays, holiday gatherings that seemed to prove we'd built something meaningful together. But now those photos tell a different story. The story of investments that didn't pay off, of love that wasn't returned, of a family that existed only as long as the support flowed in one direction. The letter I wrote for my children, the one that will be read when my will is probated, explains something I hope they'll eventually understand. Inheritance isn't an entitlement. It's a reflection of relationship. The people who inherit from us should be the people who would inherit our values, our priorities, our commitment to caring for others during difficult times. My children proved during Eleanor's illness that they don't share those values, so why would I want them to benefit from the life we built around those principles? What my children never grasped is that Eleanor and I didn't accumulate wealth for its own sake. We saved and invested and built equity in this house because we believed in taking care of family, in being prepared for emergencies, in having resources available when the people we loved needed help. When Eleanor got cancer, that was exactly the kind of emergency we'd prepared for, exactly the moment when family should rally together. Instead, our children treated our crisis as an inconvenience and our requests for help as unreasonable impositions. The organizations that will inherit our estate understand something my children never learned, that caring for others during their most vulnerable moments is not just a responsibility, but a privilege. The hospice workers who helped Eleanor die with dignity, the researchers working to find better treatments for cancer patients, the young people training to become professional caregivers. These are the people who deserve to benefit from what Eleanor and I built together. I don't take satisfaction in my children's eventual shock when they discover they've been disinherited, but I do feel peace, knowing that our life's work will support people who understand the value of compassion. Maybe someday, Michael, Sarah, and David will realize that they had every opportunity to earn their inheritance by simply being present during their mother's final illness. They chose their own convenience over family loyalty, and now they'll live with the consequences of that choice. Eleanor used to say that we don't really know people until we see how they behave during a crisis. Cancer was our family's crisis, and it revealed truths about our children that I wish I'd never had to learn. But it also revealed something about the power of holding people accountable for their choices, even when those people are your own children. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been abandoned by people who should have stood by you, leave me a comment below. Your experience matters, and sharing it might help someone else find the courage to expect better from the people in their lives. Subscribe if you believe that love without action is meaningless, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people face the full consequences of their decisions.